So the aim should be that both funds should be operated in a sound way with a view to bringing the reserves in the PRF to a level which the fund becomes then self-sustaining with sufficient funds and sufficient resources to meet solvency requirements without the need for a card. Where a Takaful operator provides a card facility, the undrawn card should be earmarked within the shareholders' fund, and this amount should be distinct from the amount of the Takaful operator's own capital. It's very important that there's no double counting. Even although the card is capital backing for the PRF, any investment income generated from the undrawn card will be considered to belong to the shareholders, so long as it remains undrawn. To ensure that the card facility remains sufficient, regular actuarial appraisals of the PRF should be carried out by the Takaful operator. And it's very important that the solvency requirements for a Takaful undertaking reflect any limitation in transferability of funds within the undertaking. Some business may be segregated from the rest, and in that case, the assets of the fund that support that line of business should be segregated so that they apply only to meet those obligations. Now, not only does the regulator need to know if there are any restrictions on the transferability of assets between these lines of business, Takaful participants will also need to be informed so that they can understand the risks to which they're exposed, and in particular, any limitations on the extent to which losses arising in their business may be absorbed by surplus funds in another. Turning now to the third key feature, the IFSB has stated that solvency control should sit at 2 levels, in the shareholders' fund and in the PRF. And by establishing controls at 2 levels, it's hoped that the Takaful operator and the regulator can take prompt action to avert any potential insolvency. Solvency requirements should be based on 4 concepts: the minimum capital requirement and the prescribed capital requirement for a PRF, and the minimum target capital and the prescribed target capital for the shareholders' fund. The prescribed capital requirement and the prescribed target capital signify the highest solvency level, while the minimum capital requirement and the minimum target capital signify a solvency level which, if breached, is likely to lead to regulatory action. Where there has been a breach, the Takaful operator will need to put forward a plan to the regulator to rectify the solvency deficiency. And if no acceptable plan is put forward and implemented within a reasonable time frame, intervention is likely from the regulator. And that could include measures to address solvency levels, such as drawdown from the card, measures to protect participants until solvency levels are restored, such as restrictions on underwriting new lines of business, measures intended to enable the regulator to better understand the situation, and that could be increased supervision or reporting, and measures that strengthen or replace the Takaful operator's management, or which strengthen its risk management framework and corporate governance. The fourth key feature requires Takaful undertakings to take account of the quality of the capital to absorb losses in different financial stages of a Takaful undertaking. In other words, when it's trading as a going concern and if it ever is insolvent. In assessing the ability of capital to absorb losses, Takaful operators need to consider the extent to which capital is fully paid up and the extent it can be called upon to absorb losses, the extent to which capital cannot be withdrawn, and the extent to which capital is free from encumbrances. In order for a card to be accepted for solvency purposes, the regulator needs to be satisfied that it cannot be withdrawn by the Takaful operator before the PRF is able to meet solvency requirements independently of the card facility, and that the Takaful operator has given its consent to the regulator that in a winding up it will treat any card that has been paid out as having been donated to the PRF. The fifth key feature recognises that Takaful undertakings are in a similar position to conventional insurers with regard to the management of risk. They face similar exposures, and just like a conventional insurer, the Takaful operator will need to ensure that its risk management framework is appropriate to deal with the complexity, the size and the mix of the Takaful undertakings operations. Takaful operators manage effectively 2 distinct sets of risks. The first relates to the Takaful operator's fiduciary duty to manage the fund to best protect the participants in the fund, and the second relates to its own need to have adequate capital to meet its financial obligations. The approach which has been adopted by the IFSB is to determine the value of the assets and liabilities and to calculate the additional capital required to offset the potential impact of each risk component. The assessment of the overall capital requirements should be carried out through a modelling approach, either a standard model which is approved by the regulator or a model which is used by the Takaful operator but which again is approved by the regulator. But in either case, the model should be used to test the ability fully of the Takaful undertaking to meet its obligations. The sixth key feature reflects the fact that participants can be exposed to the risk of loss, not just through underwriting and investment failure, but also through lack of liquidity, particularly where there's an unexpected volume of claims. Takaful operations are also at risk to the general problems such as litigation, fraud, wasted capital from initiatives which have not worked. Losses can also be exacerbated by inadequate internal controls, weak risk management systems, inadequate training, and deficient management oversight. So while regulatory capital provides a buffer to absorb losses, it is not a sufficient risk mitigant on its own. The Takaful operator needs to have a comprehensive risk management framework in place, and that framework needs to include steps to comply fully with Sharia principles. The Takaful operator should perform its own risk and solvency assessment and have risk and capital management processes in place to monitor its capital adequacy. This assessment will also help the Takaful operator decide if there's a need for additional capital and whether a card facility should be drawn on. And the assessment should be carried out separately on the PRF and on the shareholders' fund. The final key feature requires that material information regarding the solvency requirements for a Takaful undertaking should be publicly disclosed. This is intended to act as an incentive for Takaful operators to conduct their business in a prudent manner, and it will lead to more effective accountability. Not only will this help safeguard the integrity of Takaful operations, but it will assist potential participants in evaluating the financial standing of Takaful undertakings and the risks to which they're exposed. Again, in the aid of transparency, Takaful operators should describe in their annual report the risk management structures in place for identifying, monitoring and controlling risks and maintaining solvency. So I'm conscious you're waiting for lunch. This is a very, very quick canter through what is a very, very important piece of work by the IFSB, but I hope it's given you some flavour of the work that's been carried out. Thank you.